on Saturday night in Texas. No question about it. Frankie Edgar was the answer and then some. Welcome into MMA Live Extra. I'm Kerry Chow. Edgar put on one of the strongest performances of his career, defeating Cub Swanson by 5th round submission. Here's what he had to say after the fight.
I felt strong. I felt good. I think in my, past fights before the last two, I've stood up and boxed a lot. But I'm a wrestler. That's where I came from. And I'm a black belt in jiu-jitsu under Ricardo Almeida, and I think it showed today.
To break this one down from Las Vegas, ESPN MMA writer Brett Okamoto, and in Oakland, the author of Fightnomics, Reed Kuhn. Brett, we're going to start with you. You were there, octagon side for this, and was this the best we've seen from the answer?
I wouldn't call this the best ever Frankie Edgar. For me, that distinction would still go back to when he was fighting at 155. A few special fights. The second and third time he fought Gray Maynard, had to come back from nasty first rounds in those two title fights. When he fought BJ Penn, when BJ Penn was on the top of the world, beat him twice. Those were special performances. But I think this was his best performance at 145 pounds. And what I will say is that this was one of the arguments as to why Frankie Edgar needed to move or should move from 155 to 145, is that this is an option for him. The reason I think he fell in love with his boxing is because he was always fighting bigger guys. It was just tough for him as a lightweight champion to get guys to the ground and keep them on the ground. Fighting guys like Ben Henderson, Gray Maynard, just difficult to keep guys of that size down. But now what we're seeing at 145 pounds when he's facing guys his size, this is an option for him. And if you don't have the ground skills to fight Frankie Edgar, you can get embarrassed like what happened to Cub Swanson on Saturday.
Yeah, Edgar can definitely make you pay. Reed, anyone who watched this fight could easily see how dominant Edgar was, but do the numbers represent the same thing?
Yeah, actually, in the first round, you could make an argument. It was pretty close. Swanson actually outlanded Edgar 15-13 in terms of significant strikes, and that's on fewer attempts. So Swanson was the more accurate fighter with his hands, at least when he was on his feet. Unfortunately for him, it didn't stay that way. The takedowns came into play towards the end of the round, and then that was the story the rest of the fight. Completely different rounds 2 through 5. Edgar outlanded Swanson 80-16 in the final 4 rounds. Mix in 7 takedowns, 16 guard passes, 2 submission attempts. It was very dominant outside of round 1. So that's the portion of Edgar's game that we didn't really see in some of those fights, and he said it after the fight. He mixed in his wrestling, and when Edgar wrestles, he is dominant.
Reed, Edgar also moved his way up, an all-time UFC list during this fight. What is the list, and what does it mean for his standing with the sport's greats?
Edgar surpassed the 5-hour mark for cage time in the UFC, which is pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. That's actual fight time, 5 hours spent fighting UFC caliber opponents. So that puts him #1 among active UFC fighters. It's #3 all time. And he also, with these 7 additional takedown attempts, moved into 2nd place among active fighters. The asterisk on both of those lists is that whether or not George St. Pierre comes back out of his semi-retirement, he, of course, would be #1 on both of those lists. But anytime you start putting someone on a list with George St. Pierre multiple times in terms of all-time UFC anything, you're starting to get into Hall of Fame territory. And Frankie Edgar might still be getting better. He still has a lot of fight time left in him. I would expect to see him at the top of a lot of these lists by the time he finishes.
Yeah, being compared to GSP, not too shabby. Brett, the talk coming into the fight was that a W still wouldn't seal the deal for the next title shot against Jose Aldo. But what about now?
Yeah, look, I think as dominant as Frankie Edgar was on Saturday, and it was a terrific performance, anybody who's following the sport closely, I think, expects Conor McGregor to get the next shot at Jose Aldo if he defeats Dennis Siver in January. This was more of a title fight for Cub Swanson than it was for Frankie Edgar. Frankie fought Jose Aldo already, lost to him unanimous decision in February of 2013. So where does Frankie Edgar go from here? I don't know how likely of a fight this is, but I'd like to throw it out there anyway. I think Frankie Edgar should fight Chad Mendes. Why not? I know that Mendes is coming off of a loss in his last fight. He was just in the fight of the year caliber 5-rounder with Jose Aldo last month. But these are two guys who are at the absolute top of their game. There's no one ahead of them except for Aldo. These two guys are in the top 4, top 5 of that division easy, so why not have them go ahead and face each other? That's really the only fight that makes sense in my mind for both these guys, is Chad Mendes and Frankie Edgar facing off against each other.
All right, good stuff. That's Brett Okamoto and Reed Kuhn. Thanks so much for the insight, guys. All right, for more news From the UFC, keep it locked to the MMA page here on ESPN.com. I'm Kerry Chow. Thanks for watching MMA Live Extra. We'll see you later.